Yeah. So I'm looking, it's connecting. So we're standing by for me to run opening video. Okay, looks like it's connected. All right, so running opening video, we will load Glenn and Stefan, single Glenn. Rolling video now.
Good morning. I'm Glenn Spencer, the Senior Vice President.
Stefan, just to be safe.
I can still hear the moderator in the background there. Sorry, let's try again. Good morning. I'm Glenn Spencer, the Senior Vice President of the Employment Policy Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and I'd like to welcome you to today's virtual event, Tackling Forced Labor in Supply Chains. On July 30th, the United Nations recognizes World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. This International Day is an occasion to educate the public, mobilize political will and resources to address this problem, and to measure progress. Now, as you've heard me stress at every one of our meetings, human trafficking is a global problem affecting millions of people each year who are illegally lured into forced labor and sexual exploitation through force, fraud, or coercion. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security estimates that human trafficking is second only to drug trafficking as the most profitable form of transnational crime, generating billions of dollars each year in illicit profit. The U.S. State Department estimates that 25 million people worldwide are victims of human trafficking, and all of them share one thing in common: the loss of their freedom. Now, unfortunately, COVID may have made this problem worse. The 2021 Trafficking in Persons report, published by the U.S. State Department and the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crimes, emphasizes that stay-at-home orders have caused an uptick in suspected cases of human trafficking. By making those that are vulnerable more susceptible to recruitment and exploitation, and by making law enforcement less likely to respond. The U.S. federal government has been taking active measures, such as cracking down on suppliers doing business in Xinjiang province in China, strengthening ties between Mexico and Canada, and seizing products at ports of entry through the increased use of withhold and release orders. Now, at the Chamber, we're working to align the activities of the private sector and the federal government through the task force to eradicate human trafficking. We established the task force as an advisory group made up of members who work with the federal government and the private sector to develop holistic solutions and provide a united voice against human trafficking. And that's because while we know that business has an important role to play, we cannot do this work alone. The business community needs to partner with governments and non-governmental organizations to address the scope and depth of this problem. So the task force develops toolkits, we host forums, and we engage in advocacy work to shine a spotlight on this problem. This year, the task force has released 2 publications, our annual report and the CHTCS Journal Special Edition, both of which are available on the Chamber's website. The task force has also hosted 2 events: a forum on January 11th to commemorate National Human Trafficking Awareness Day, which was called COVID-19 Impact on Human Trafficking, and an event that aired on May 6th, sponsored by the staffing firm Randstad and the Alliance for Freedom, Restoration, and Justice. And that event was called Business Solutions: Empowering Human Trafficking Survivors. Videos of both of those events are also available on the Chamber's website. I'm now going to turn the virtual stage over to Stefan Markulowicz, who is the chair of the Chamber's task force, and he will introduce today's event. So again, thank you all for joining.
Thanks a lot, Glenn, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to briefly discuss the rationale of why the U.S. Chamber is concerned about forced labor and why we've established this task force. Businesses face significant economic, reputational, and legal risks if their suppliers engage in forced labor. Because of that, companies have developed, or if they have their suppliers engage in forced labor. Because of that, companies have developed extensive measures to proactively detect forced labor in their supply chains. There's been a lot of good work done by companies to address this issue, and there's a lot of innovation going on today. Many of these best practices are outlined in the Chamber's joint toolkit with A21, available on the Chamber's website, which you should look at if you haven't had a chance to do already. However, the Chamber is concerned about the increased amount of legislation modeled on the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, and laws in Australia. These laws were focused on disclosure. However, governments are beginning to move the needle beyond mere disclosure and are considering or passing legislation that either holds companies liable for disclosure violation or requires them to take measures to identify and avert human rights risks, including forced labor. For example, in June of this year, Germany enacted a supply chain law that requires enhanced due diligence of supply chains and requires companies to identify and avert human rights risks they become aware of. The law empowers the government to levy fines for violations. Canada is also considering legislation, which we have discussed in a prior task force meeting, and the European Union is expected to issue a human rights due diligence directive soon. Over the years, legislative proposals have been considered by the US Congress on these topics. Examples include the Business Supply Chain Transparency on Trafficking and Slavery Act, sponsored by Representative Carolyn Maloney, and the Slave-Free Business Certification Act, introduced by Senator Josh Hawley. The US Chamber of Commerce is deeply concerned about potential legislation that would impose a one-size-fits-all approach to supply chain disclosure and reporting on companies. Such legislation would be burdensome on business and, given the diversity of the global supplier network, not realistic. More pointedly, we are particularly concerned about potential legislation that would contain measures to hold companies liable in US courts for actions taken by unrelated entities in a supply chain. Suppliers are separate entities, and often they're not simply a single entity, but a network of many. Such legislation also creates the possibility of adverse consequences of having companies pull out of developing countries where workers rely on income provided by their jobs. Make no mistake, forced labor is pernicious. Companies are doing a lot to combat the problem. There's a lot of innovation going on here that has enabled companies to combat this problem. The Chamber's task force is working hard to educate policymakers and others of the good work that is being done in this space to combat this horrific problem. Today's forum marks the beginning of a constructive dialogue between the business community and the federal government under the Biden administration to achieve our collective objective of ending human trafficking once and for all. At the end of the program, I will moderate a session featuring representatives from the United States Department of State, the U.S. Office of Trade Representative, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. These government officials will discuss their agency's viewpoints on this topic and offer thoughts on how the business community can be of assistance. We want to extend a special thank you to our sponsor, the Counter Human Trafficking Compliance Solutions, for making this forum a possibility today. I hope you enjoyed today's event and find it informative. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm James Wiley, the COO of Counter Human Trafficking Compliance Solutions. It's a woman-owned advisory firm founded with a mission to work confidentially with companies to help them identify and address the issue of human trafficking within their supply chain. I'm joined today with Jakub Bujans. We're going to do a little fireside chat here. He's the CEO of After Eden Pictures, and Jakub, maybe you could give us a little background and information on how you became involved in this.
Yeah, Wiley, thanks. And thanks to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce tackling a very, very important issue. I'm the founder of ShareTogetherNow.org, which is an organization fighting and combating the sexual exploitation of human beings, particularly children, minors, but also adults. And our personal story getting involved started in 1994, Wiley, as an immigrant from South Africa. My sister was trafficked in South Africa through the corporate structure. And it was interesting because at the time, the conversation was very different regarding child sexual exploitation, or what we would call, sex trafficking. And I think it's important everybody here understands human trafficking. There's, identified 25 plus forms of trafficking. When we go into focusing in the exploitation of children or sexual exploitation, period, that's where we focus. You know, we really do gap analysis globally to see where does it come from, the trends, how it intersects with the marketplace, which today's conversation is so prevalent because it does intersect. You know, so when we look at domestic trafficking of persons domestically in the U.S., yes, you know, it's really important for us to be able to target areas and reasons that force trafficking to happen, such as, you know, migration of people, not just across a border, but for whatever reason inside the country, either because of a large event that's happening, or for some other reason. As I became aware of with your technology, you're able to pinpoint, you know, even things like work patterns globally, and looking at the intersection between domestic child trafficking within communities and big corporations, in the relationship between the two, whether it's labor trafficking, et cetera. Because when we see labor trafficking, there's sex trafficking and sexual exploitation.
Right. I think that's something that people don't realize. And, you know, one of the ideas behind this, you know, with our focus, how we go through a supply chain and we help companies look at their supply chains and figure out where they might have some risk in there. People don't get the idea so many times that the world is how it is. And if if people are separated out, or they're in an area that may be remote, or they're working in a different area, culturally separated, that promotes an environment that's very conducive to not only labor trafficking, but sex trafficking.
Yeah, 100%. If we look at it from the eyes of the one who exploits, right? They're looking for a soft target. And it's not kidnapping. You know, we're under 2% of this crime is kidnapping. We're looking at a transient person, a person that's a soft target in a community. And if you're looking at a child with two parents at home, there's different vulnerabilities than a child that is destitute, that is, you know, homeless, or is in the foster care system, or is a runaway, right? And when you get into areas of the world, such as the coffee farming industry, for instance, right, which was below the poverty line. Now, there is forced labor at times, but whenever that person is compromised in life, it's a target for a predator.
Right.
And that, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, and somehow just our take on it, whenever it is labor trafficking, it's already a person who's under duress and under the control of another human being. Somehow always sexual exploitation just finds its way in, as we see drugs, et cetera, all the other things. So it's interesting, we can actually narrow it down with tech. And it's about time we fight this battle with technology. Yeah. Because it's you know, perpetrators are using technology at a rapid increase. And that's what we saw during COVID, really, is the amount of time children spend on the iPhone at home. We asked mothers to homeschool. They did not homeschool us. And so it's more engagement. And we've almost, in our fight, seen the removal of the pimp, as we would call it. And that John the buyer got direct access to a potential target or a potential victim through devices. And whether it's foreign or domestic, the habits of the one exploiting tends to be the same. It's human behavioral science, right? And so the intersection, which I'm so excited about with your organization, the intersection of saying, okay, what can a corporation do, and to connect the dots for a corporation and say, look, when we think labor trafficking or supply chain management or critical sourcing, we have to think sexual exploitation at the same time.
Right. Now, you know, another thing I'd like to talk about, and I'd like to kind of explain to the chamber here, is how intelligence comes together, because a lot of people don't see this. And you work in sex trafficking, I work in, you know, identifying possible risk in supply chains. But we can really attack this problem well together. As we go through this, and let's say I find possible risk within a supply chain, and we work to fix that environment, and we're talking to these people, and we're making their lives better within the company. Sometimes these people come forward and say, hey, there's a little problem that we're having outside of my supply chain. You know, these people are being taken advantage of, something the company may not have a hold over. But then I come to somebody like you, and we can do this confidentially. I can feed you information, and vice versa. We found this works very well.
And you're coming from, and thank you for your service to our country. You come from a position where we have to look at this as a military op. or I say, if you look at football, we have special teams, we have offense, defense, coordinators, and it's a cohesive, comprehensive attack because we find these perpetrators move. You've got cells that traffic drugs, that start trafficking children or adults, or there's labor enforced. It's about the dollar. And any way to make the dollar. And so when we start feeding off each other and go, okay, within the corporation, it's great supply chain management. Downstream, they can provide tools, and it was mentioned earlier, to de-risk the corporation's liability, to say, here's a tool to pass down to some of your critical supply chain, right? In that conversation now, if there's a trust built in the corporation where they go, look, the corporation is attentive to labor trafficking, to forced labor, etc. The workforce, the labor force, what I've seen, the labor force in that corporation will come forth and we'll talk about the community. And say, look, maybe not in the corporation, but when Sarah goes home, let me tell you about Sarah's home environment, because the misconception is that if Sarah is being sex trafficked, she must be in chains, in a van, remote, and we must send a search and rescue party. Not the case. Familial trafficking globally is the #1 form and rise of trafficking today. And so it's within an environment where it's hidden in plain sight. And I think once that trust is built in a corporation, that this corporation is taking every measure to at least combat, even if it's just labor trafficking, you're going to see people start sharing intel, like what you do when you do a military op. You build community relationships, and it's normally through food and through children and safety and education. And then they bring information, and now we start sharing information where I get into saying, hey, there's a child trafficking ring or a human trafficking ring in sexual exploitation, Wiley. Maybe look here and see, is it linked to labor force or supply chain?
Right. And you alluded to something earlier. One of the things we do is take a look at all information available. And you talked about weather. People didn't understand how we actually at CHTCS can actually take weather, do predictive analytics on it to show where it may be putting people at risk, where they become displaced because of either a drought or a famine or the failure of Robusto coffee in the North Highlands Mountains of Guatemala. This all ties together into how we look at this as one world. And that's why you and I are sitting here having this chat.
Absolutely.
Sex trafficking, labor trafficking, that environment, the weather failure, all that, you have to take a look at all of that. And that's what we try to do. And I know that's what you try to do. And that's where, as a business, if you want to have a big effect on this, if you take a look at the whole picture and understand how much you can actually do to change somebody's life, to change a lot of people's lives by looking through your supply chain, just start and just do that due diligence down the chain.
I can argue now that I really understand the technology at CHTCS, what you do. I can argue and say just focusing on one component like weather. If we look at predictive analytics, right, and say the weather patterns. So if we look at the U.S. produce, for instance, in U.S. Yuma, Salinas Valley, right? We import a lot of produce, a lot. Produce is very fickle product. And we've got a big problem with produce. Every November, we look at E. coli outbreak, et cetera, coming for reasons, right? And it's weather related.
That's fair.
Right? Now, so if we start looking at that and say, okay, in these seasons, in these areas of the world with predictive analytics, where do people come from? Or when there is a quote unquote gold rush and a discovery or whatever, or in the oil and gas industry, people migrate because there's new opportunity. Well, they're going to migrate to opportunity. I can then say, this is what we're hearing on the ground from a trafficking standpoint. You're going to be able to look at political climate or the economic climate, the weather climate with the technology, and say, here's the connecting dots. And they cross-pollinate, and it's no different than departments, law enforcement departments working together across different agencies, whether it's FBI, CIA, Homeland, saying, look, this is what we're seeing. But I think it's time that we take the economical aspect and the labor trafficking aspect into account. My takeaway is just the NGOs, and we're an NGO. We can't work without government. We can't work without tech. It's about time we step in. But we've approached this issue pretty one-dimensional at times, right? And I think it's just time to have a comprehensive look and say, look, it is connected. I've never seen us do a single rescue on a child where we did not also have to interact with the DEA. Right. Where there's drugs or illegal arms or there's forced labor, right? And I'm talking about domestically in the 50 states, beyond just talking about migration, across a border or for whatever. So we have to, as U.S. corporations, one, de-risk the corporate liability, because it's coming for sure. As we hear, other nations are enacting law, and some of these policies may be pretty strict and may choke corporations. So what can a corporation do? I'll ask you to say, look, we're going to look into critical sourcing, resource management, labor related, and I can then make the argument, if you do that, you will curb sex trafficking. 100%, without even focusing on particularly the sexual exploitation of minors or sex trafficking of adults, where we have force, fraud, coercion. But remember, 17 and under in all 50 states, we don't need to prove force, fraud, coercion with a child. They're a victim, right? And so when we start looking at those elements, if we can work with the corporate sector through technology, they'll deliver a massive blow into sex trafficking without necessarily even saying, hey, we're focusing on sex trafficking.
Right. And I thank you for that. And I hope the chamber understands and now has a better picture of the relationship between these two. And I mean, that's just how the world is. And, hopefully through our technology, through the global risk assessment technology that we built, that enables companies to look down through their supply chain confidentially so they can work on this within and making their own plan and strategically planning this out, and then come to people and make their lives better just holistically across the board.
Look, I've never seen a single corporation that actually just showed people that, look, we're investing in your lifestyle because you have a more productive employee. There's no question. Your ROI, at the end of the day, the ROI is going to go up.
Yeah.
A more productive employee is somebody, a happy employee. And it doesn't take a lot, actually. I'm a business owner. It doesn't take that much to get an employee to say, well, this company is really focusing on my family and my health. But when they do that, information will flow the other direction. And then we're going to see a great, symbiosis between corporate America and the NGOs, and start sharing information and say, hey, look, we're not trafficking experts. We're running a business here. We just want to make sure downstream our supply chain is clean from labor and forced labor, but we're getting intel and linking arms with the NGOs who fight sex trafficking particularly. So it's not that we're asking U.S. corporations to become anti-sex trafficking experts. It's just saying there's a lot of intel.
Yeah.
There's intel. How do we gather the intel, cross-collateralize it through technology, but it's going to have to be through tech.
Yeah.
Because we can't, nobody can just up staff and all of a sudden build a department within a corporation and say, well, now we're going to focus on sexual exploitation, So it's just do what you do as a corporation, incorporating technology such as, this amazing technology, and then get very valuable data, and then link arms with NGOs, law enforcement. Again, I'll say we can't do it without law enforcement. I mean, it's very important. Yeah.
So, I want to be respectful of the time. I think we're coming up on our limit here, but I want to thank the chamber and kind of explain, that's why we joined the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the world's largest group of businesses. And so I'd like to thank you. If you want more information from us, you can see the January edition of the journal, the CHTCS journal that was produced with the Chamber of Commerce. Our contact information is in there. And then
for us, Share Together Now, as spelled, sharetogethernow.org is our organization fighting trafficking, or my name, yakuboyens.com, is going to all lead you to the same place. And it's really about us. We're coming in saying we want to work with the community, with the business community. We want to offer what we have, and what we do, and the other amazing organizations in the country that fight this fight with us.
And they can get us both together. I mean, this is our fight.
Yes.
And so if you want to talk to us both,
we do collaborate already.
You can just give one or the other a call and get together. So
thank you very much. Wiley, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabriella Herzog with the U.S. Council for International Business. Our conversation today is taking place as part of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's 2021 program recognizing World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. It is my honor to introduce Martha Newton, who is the Deputy Director General for Policy at the International Labor Organization. Welcome, Martha. And I wonder if we could get started with your telling our audience a little bit more about the ILO and what the situation is today regarding forced labor.
Well, thank you, Gabriella, and thank you to the United States Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity to be here today on World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. So just a little bit about the ILO. We're the only tripartite UN agency since 1919. ILO has been bringing governments, workers, and employers together. We have 187 member states to set labor standards, develop policies, and devise programs to promote decent work for men and women. One of the major issues we work on is forced labor and human trafficking, which, as we all know today, is so tragically common still in our global economy. Our latest ILO estimates that we put out a few years ago with the Walk Free Foundation and IOM showed that on any given day, nearly 25 million men, women, and children worldwide were forced to work against their will or under threat. And of this total, 21 million were in privately imposed forced labor, and 4 million were in state-imposed forced labor. 4.3 million were children, and 15.6 million were women and girls. And half of all persons in forced labor in the private economy were in situations of debt bondage. Today's bonded labor is associated in part with coercive practices, including exorbitant fees in the private recruitment industry. And there are also gender divides with women and girls in particular, subjected to commercial sexual exploitation. I should also highlight that victims of forced labor in the private economy around the world generate approximately 150 billion per year in illicit profits. And forced labor thrives in an incubator of poverty and vulnerability. It's low levels of education and literacy, precarious migration, and other factors. But that said, ILO research shows that forced labor is not an issue solely in developing economies. Profits from forced labor industries are higher in developed economies and in the European Union than anywhere else in the world. So responding to forced labor, appropriate policy choices are really critical, Gabriella. The ILO forced labor instruments, conventions number 29 and 105, as well as the protocol to convention number 29 and recommendation 203, adopted in 2014, really provide key guidance in this regard. So these instruments highlight that forced labor, slavery, and human trafficking are serious crimes, and they have to be dealt with as such. But it also made clear that these abuses can't be eliminated through just criminal law enforcement efforts alone. We have to have strong emphasis on prevention, protection, and remedies, in addition to enforcement, underpinned by strengthened international cooperation and dialogue.
Thank you for that helpful introduction. Part of what I think the ILO does so well is to look at the drivers of forced labor and other issues. So you're not just looking at what to do about forced labor, you're looking more broadly at the root causes of forced labor as well.
It's exactly the point, Gabriella. I mean, I think we have to look at the drivers of forced labor if we really want to solve the problem. When it comes to challenges, we know that the root causes of forced labor and human trafficking include so many issues. It's informality, lack of access to social protection, weak governance structures in countries, discrimination, crises like the one we're seeing now, and low awareness of labor and human rights. So solutions really that address these factors are really part of creating sustainable change. And at the ILO, we're really focused now on having strategies that provide for a broad-based, job-rich, human-centered recovery with decent work opportunities for all. And we have to recognize the role, the important role of sustainable enterprises as generators of employment and promoters of innovation and decent work as we work through this recovery. So that's really why in our recent global call to action that we just passed at the International Labor Conference, we have focused in some recovery areas of inclusive economic growth and employment, universal social protection, and protection for all workers. And I bring this up because specifically under the protection for workers, we've prioritized redoubling our efforts to have a specific emphasis on the elimination of child labor and forced labor. And of course, the secret to our sauce, I say at the ILO, is social dialogue. We have the unique ability. This is where we're distinguished from other UN organizations, and that we're tripartite. We can convene tripartite action. And as we've seen, when we're able to do this, and when employers, particularly employers, along with workers and governments, can contribute so strongly, we can really move the needle on the issue of forced labor.
I really appreciate your framing those issues more broadly, Martha. And I definitely agree with you on the importance of social dialogue, or the secret sauce, as you call it, of the ILO. We've certainly seen that the tripartite nature of the ILO, with governments, workers, and employers all working together, it's really been able to help move the needle on these issues. So can you share a few examples of this, maybe a success story on how the ILO has worked in a tripartite way to deal with forced labor?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. One example for understanding how we rely on tripartism is to promote these conventions that I've just spoke about, the protocols and the recommendations, is the 50 for Freedom campaign. I mentioned it briefly, but this campaign is led by the ILO, our partners, which includes the International Trade Union Confederation and the International Organization of Employers. We now have well over 50 ratifications of Protocol 29, and business has really been instrumental in those efforts. I think probably just a couple tangible examples to talk about that are interesting for those who are watching today is probably Uzbekistan cotton. That's one. The cotton harvest in Uzbekistan is the world's largest recruitment effort, with just under 2 million people a year picking cotton every year from September to November. We've been monitoring the cotton harvest in Uzbekistan since 2013 on both child labor and forced labor. And in 2015, under an agreement with the World Bank and with funding from the EU, Switzerland, the United States, and Germany, we've been working on this issue. However, the role of the private sector and other stakeholders in expressing concern about the use of forced labor and child labor in Uzbekistan helped draw really important attention to the matter. So I think that's a good story. In our latest assessment, we found that in some provinces and in districts, we have very few or no forced labor cases in 2020, and that's really amazing. Probably another example that I would give would probably be the ILO and our work in Qatar. I do like to use this example because I think it shows the full range of how the ILO works. So it came out of our supervisory system, in which there was a worker complaint against the state of Qatar around forced labor and migrant workers in construction, specifically with an eye towards the 2022 World Cup. That complaint led to a comprehensive labor rights program and the opening of an ILO project office. And with our assistance, Qatar has developed national policies and action plans against forced labor. I think many years ago, and I think back when Qatar didn't even want to talk about these issues, and then we have just 2 weeks ago, we have Minister Al-Obeidly, who was just named a trafficking in persons hero by the State Department for his efforts in Qatar. It just shows that working together, and employers were a big part of coming to the table on this issue, that working together, we can make a difference. That's not to say that things are perfect in Qatar. They still have lots of work to go. But when a national government takes ownership and wants to accept responsibility, the ILO stands alongside them to support those efforts.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks for sharing those examples. And they show that when business works together with governments and trade unions, that we can really solve complex problems for the benefits of all stakeholders. So I want to speak a little bit about data. We know that the ILO provides key estimates on child labor and forced labor. What can you tell us about those numbers? We saw that the most recent child labor numbers that the ILO released were not the same as what we've seen in the last 20 years. Can you talk a little bit more about that and the importance of data?
Gabriella, data and research are so critical. It's critical to the ILO, and we're constantly increasing our efforts to gather more and collect more reliable data in order to equip employers and governments and workers to be able to have a true understanding of what the magnitude of the problem is. But I will tell you, it is not an easy task to be able to identify decent work deficits in the case of forced labor. Measuring the incidence of forced labor really presents unique methodological challenges. I won't go into all the details, but you can only imagine. It's obtaining a representative sample that can be used to make inferences about the total population, or obtaining accurate information from the individuals who are being sampled. There's also, I could go on, choices about structure, about how our surveys are organized. But, I go into detail about all of this because all these choices are critical to us because we want good data.
Data is a good jumping off point, I think, for a discussion about innovation, if we could pivot. Employers, civil society, and governments need to work together to address underlying labor and market conditions. Businesses are using innovative approaches, including technology for traceability, and as well as the use of audits. What is the ILO's take on where this work is heading?
Business, we all know, brings innovative tools and technology and practices that provide a lot of information on the situation in their sector. And vice versa, government agencies gather information that's critical for businesses and their supply chains. So sharing and exchanging of information that are, of course, non-competitive of nature is really key. So that, I think that's one example of how governments and private sector can work together. And I give that as an example of teeing off to innovation, because again, for any sort of innovative partnership, collaboration is key. And so the ILO and where we're coming in is, again, we're able to bring convening power. And it's the ability to bring all the partners around the table to address these issues together. So innovation's key, Gabriella, especially when it comes to data generation. So we're excited that we've announced just a couple months ago that under Alliance 8.7, which is our global partnership to achieve SDG target 8.7, a competition, which we're really excited about, an innovation challenge to create digital information systems for collaborative work to end child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking.
Well, that's exciting to hear about this innovation challenge. And definitely, we all agree that data and good tools are critical. So I would encourage everyone listening to check it out and bring your best ideas.
Yes, absolutely. And I forgot to mention, so there's going to be 3 winners. The winning proposals are going to receive technical support to turn their ideas into ready to implement prototypes. So we're so excited about this. And we're going to be able to really have a strong platform for this, because they're going to be able to roll it out at the next global conference on child labor in May of 2022. So the key deadline, August 15th, 2021, we'll be announcing the winners in October, and the implementation and results will be piloted in 2022.
Martha, can you talk to us about a few other examples of how you engage the business community in working to bring an end to forced labor and human trafficking? We've heard some strong country examples, but are there other ways for business to get involved with the ILO?
So I briefly mentioned Alliance 8.7, but it really is the global partnership for eradicating forced labor, modern slavery, human trafficking, and child labor around the world. So there are many ways that business networks can become involved in Alliance 8.7. You can become a direct partner, participate in an action group, or form collaborations with other stakeholders to deliver specific contributions. I also have to mention another entity at the ILO, and that's the Global Business Network on Forced Labor. So the Global Business Network brings together the ILO with businesses of all sizes and sectors and their networks from around the world. And we really aim to capitalize on the work being done in the private sector and the ILO to eradicate forced labor in supply chains and economies. Another example is Better Work. I think a lot of folks who are watching today know of Better Work, but it's mainly in the ready-made garment sector. And also a program called the SCORE program, which operates in a number of sectors, again, with a focus on SMEs, or just some additional programs that companies can get involved in.
One topic we haven't covered is migrant workers and their vulnerability to forced labor. Here in the United States, We have that concern with regards to migrants from the Northern Triangle countries. How does the ILO look at this issue?
We know that migrant workers are more vulnerable to forced labor. You know, we've just seen across the world that concerns are rising about the exploitation of the recruitment of migrant workers, which are about 169 million globally, Gabriella, in the world. This is why we at the ILO launched what we call the Fair Recruitment Initiative. And it sets out programs and cooperation that delivers partners to ensure that recruitment systems are effective and meet standards, that they protect workers and improve development outcomes for migrant workers and their families. And we operate in more than 30 countries, as well as at the global level.
So we've spoken a bit about the importance of good data, innovation, forced labor in the broader context of COVID-19, some strong examples of technical assistance, but we haven't yet spoken a bit about the business reality of regulation. Recently, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, and Germany, they've passed legislation that mandates disclosures about a company's policies and practices to identify, prevent, or remediate forced labor. These regulatory requirements are complex, and they can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Where can the ILO bring clarity?
Well, you know, the ILO can bring clarity, Gabriella, because it's our international labor standards and the fundamental principles and rights at work that are the benchmarks for any legislation and company policies that are aimed at addressing forced labor at any level. And businesses should also refer to our tripartite declaration of principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy, which we call the M&E Declaration. It's the only tripartite document out there that specifically addresses the roles and responsibilities of business based on international labor standards.
As we draw to a close, I'd like to turn our attention to a personal question, if that's okay. It would be so interesting for those listening to better understand, how did you get involved in this work in the first place?
A lot of people know that I've spent a lot of time at the Department of Labor. I've spent over 7 years in 2 stints in ILAB. It's one of the, I think one of the strongest U.S. government agencies dealing with forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking. But, you know, I first started this and was exposed to this work because I was working at a prosecutor's office. I was the chief of a violent crime victim services division in the early 1990s. None of the framework for how we work in human trafficking existed back then. And I met some people who had experienced some of the most horrific abuse that I had ever witnessed or seen in my life. And it was forced labor. So since then, you know, I've worked in government. I've worked for NGOs, the International Justice Mission, also a very solid organization. I've also worked on the ground and in the field in Ghana and child labor and fishing. So, you know, but over my 20 years now of doing this type of work, I've been so impressed by seeing the progression of business and employers, and just so much leadership and entities who have really stepped up. And I know a lot of you who are participating today are some of those partners. So I just want to say thank you so much for your contributions and for your efforts. Please know that I stand with you, that the ILO stands with you in your efforts. And we really have to continue to work collectively and to work together to end this scourge once and for all. So thanks again so much, Gabriella, for having me here today. And thanks again to the United States Chamber of Commerce for convening this important event today.
Thank you, Martha. Well, it's been a very rich discussion. So many examples of the critical role that the ILO and its secret sauce of tripartism with workers, employers, and governments together working on these critical issues like ending forced labor and trafficking in persons. We wish you and the entire ILO team success, and U.S. Business stands ready to contribute. Thank you.
Great. Goodbye from Geneva.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting discussion with Martha Newton, and we wish her the best of luck in her role. I'm going to turn over now to the United States government, and we have a really great panel of agency representatives. I want to introduce three distinguished government officials. The first one is Dr. Kari Johnston, who's the Acting Director of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons at the United States State Department. Josh Kagan, Acting Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Labor, Office of the U.S. Trade Rep. And Eric Choi, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Just briefly, Dr. Johnston advises high-ranking officials on U.S. government policy and programming strategies to fight human trafficking around the world and oversees the production of the department's annual Trafficking in Persons report. Josh Kagan's responsibilities at the USTR include serving as chief negotiator of labor provisions in free trade agreements, formulating recommendations concerning countries' adherence to worker rights provisions of the U.S. Trade Preferences Program, and developing U.S. positions on the relationship between trade and labor in relevant international bodies. Eric Choi at Homeland Security is responsible for policies and initiatives that enable the flow of legitimate trade, services, capital, and technology across our nation's borders to ensure a fair, competitive, and safe trade environment. The format of this panel is that each panelist will give time for remarks, and then I will follow up with questions and answers. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, please feel free to type them into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. During their remarks, these officials will discuss the updated Xinjiang Business Advisory, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force under Section 741 of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement Implementation Act, and the Department of Homeland Security Center for Countering Human Trafficking. Let's start the conversation with Acting Director Dr. Johnston. Then Josh Kagan will follow, followed up by Eric Choi. Dr. Johnston, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for that introduction and for the invitation to participate in this event. And I'd also really like to thank the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for organizing today's event, and particularly on today, the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, to help us all take a moment to think about what we can do to help combat trafficking in persons. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all today on this important topic. As you all know, forced labor, which is a form of human trafficking, is a serious concern in global supply chains in practically every country and industry and region in the world. Wherever workers are unprotected or isolated, traffickers are there too, ready to prey on their vulnerability for profit. They take advantage of the complexity of today's supply chains and depend on the obscurity of the vast network of entities supplying inputs for the goods we all purchase every day. In doing so, traffickers not only commit a crime recognized in almost every country, but also inject risk, uncertainty, and unfair economic practices into global trade. Forced labor runs counter to U.S. values as a nation and exposes U.S. consumers to unknowingly purchase goods made with unethical practices. When competitors exploit workers and artificially suppress wages, American businesses and workers are left to compete on an uneven playing field. The United States has long taken a stand against forced labor in our supply chains, and the Biden-Harris administration will continue to do so. We are working to provide information and resources to U.S. businesses to help you understand, assess, and mitigate the risk of forced labor in your supply chains, and to hold accountable businesses that are not doing so, as you will hear from the various panelists today. At the State Department, we engage with foreign governments, NGOs, partners, and other U.S. agencies and international organizations, academics, the private sector, and others year-round on human trafficking. Each year, the State Department also publishes the Trafficking in Persons report, which assesses government efforts to combat trafficking in 188 countries and territories around the world, specifically looking at government efforts to prosecute traffickers, protect victims, and prevent the crime. The tier rankings that are assigned to governments are not a reflection of the scale or severity or the scope of the problem, as was just discussed in the last panel with ILO's estimate on that. But instead, the tier rankings focus on government efforts across specific commitments of those areas of prosecution, protection, and prevention and how seriously the government is taking their commitments to fulfill those crimes. Specifically, we are looking at how effectively systems address the crime and where governments and whether or not they are working to improve those efforts. We use the report and the recommendations in each narrative to encourage governments, including our own, to do more. This year, the Secretary of State released the latest 2021 Trafficking in Persons report on July 1st. That was the 21st Trafficking in Persons report. I would encourage you to take a look at the whole thing, but I wanted to mention a few countries from the report that may be of interest to this audience in particular, especially given increased attention to them recently. The 2021 TIP report highlighted concerns over forced labor in the fishing sector in 55 country narratives. In Thailand, for example, which was downgraded to Tier 2 watch list this year, where there have been widespread report of forced labor in fishing among foreign workers and fishermen, authorities continue to make inadequate efforts to identify migrant workers exploited in forced labor in the fishing sector. While authorities conducted numerous port inspections, they have never identified a victim of forced labor as a result of these measures, not just this past year, but ever. In Malaysia, which this year was downgraded to Tier 3, the government continued to conflate human trafficking and migrant smuggling crimes and did not adequately address or criminally pursue credible allegations from multiple sources of labor trafficking, including in the rubber manufacturing industry and the palm oil sector. This despite the government itself owning 33% of the largest palm, or perhaps because, of the third largest palm oil company in the world. The 2021 TIP report highlights concerns of forced labor in the mining sector in 36 country narratives as well. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there are ongoing concerns that traffickers force or coerce some adults and children to work in artisanal mines in the eastern part of the country, the government continued its efforts in cooperation with an international organization to certify such mining sites as conflict-free and child labor-free. Ministry of Mines officials visited 125 mine sites and verified none of the 3,479 miners screened were exploited in forced labor. The National Police, with support of international donors, formalized the role of mining police in the prevention, detection, protection, and prosecution of child labor, and trained 250 new mining police. Overall, the department also assessed that 11 governments continued themselves to perpetrate the crime of forced labor and having states or various forms of human trafficking, having state-sponsored human trafficking during this most recent reporting period. In China, which received a Tier 3 ranking again, the report found that the government is engaged in state-sponsored forced labor, including through the continued mass arbitrary detention of more than 1 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang region. The report also noted that these government forced labor practices have extended beyond Xinjiang to other parts of the country as well. In China, the government itself is the trafficker, and authorities use physical violence, forcible drug intake, physical and sexual abuse, and torture to force detainees to work in adjacent off-site factories, producing garments, footwear, carpets, yarn, and materials for solar power equipment, among other things. Following on this point, the U.S. government is working to provide information to the private sector on specific areas of concern. For example, in response to the situation in Xinjiang, 6 agencies from the U.S. government recently released an updated Xinjiang supply chain business advisory to alert U.S. businesses to the economic, legal, and reputational risks of doing business in Xinjiang. Among other things, the advisory lays out information about the PRC's use of forced labor as a form of repression, including in agricultural, cotton, and solar supply chains. The advisory encourages businesses to undertake heightened human rights due diligence, to identify potential links to entities operating in or linked to Xinjiang, and notes that given the severity and extent of the abuses occurring there, businesses that do not exit supply chains connected to the region could run a high risk of violating U.S. law. Beyond the criminal implications of the PRC's actions, the artificially low labor costs created and sustained by the use of forced labor results in unfair competition in global supply chains in the form of cheaper goods. This is bad for American workers It's bad for American businesses that are trying to do the right thing, and it's bad for the fight against human trafficking. As another example of the work we are doing to provide information and resources, the State Department funds the Responsible Sourcing Tool website, which you can access at responsiblesourcingtool.org, which has in-depth information on 11 industries and 44 commodities, most at risk of forced labor, and houses risk management tools to help companies understand and mitigate the risks of forced labor in their supply chains. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the ongoing discussion and hearing my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Josh.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me this morning. I apologize, first of all, I can't turn off the AC unit in the office here, so if you're hearing some white noise, I'm not in a skiff, it's just the AC, so sorry if that's distracting. But good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today to commemorate World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. On behalf of USTR, I appreciate the opportunity to join this session, and I'm looking forward to a productive conversation. As Dr. Johnstone just mentioned, this is an important issue for the Biden-Harris administration. As you know, USTR leads U.S. trade policy, and one of my primary points of emphasis today is going to be USTR's commitment to combating forced labor, including with respect to the Uyghur people and other ethnic minorities in the production of various traded products. There is no space between us and the rest of the interagency on these issues. As we do this work, we want to be in partnership with the business community, recognizing that you are an important player in the global fight against forced labor. USTR is pursuing a trade agenda that prohibits the importation of goods produced by forced labor and is committed to working with allies and trade partners to promote a fair, rule-based international trading system. Products made with forced labor do not enter that system. USMCA. On May 18th, the United States hosted the first meeting of the USMCA Free Trade Commission. In her remarks, Ambassador Tai noted that all parties to the agreement, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, agreed to ban imports on goods made with forced labor. This action demonstrates how our region is and will continue to be a global leader in addressing forced labor and how we intend to turn our values into concrete enforceable policy. On June 29th, USTR and the U.S. Department of Labor, along with our Canadian and Mexican counterparts, also convened the inaugural meeting of the USMCA's Labor Council. The meeting included an in-depth discussion on several topics, including USMCA's requirement that each party prohibit the importation of goods into its territory from other sources produced in whole or in part by forced or compulsory labor, ongoing implementation of Mexico's recent historic labor law reform, labor policies for migrant workers, and areas for ongoing and future cooperation and technical capacity building. At the virtual public session, workers, employers, civil society organizations, and the general public discussed matters related to the implementation of the USMCA's labor chapter. Now I'd like to speak about the WTO Fisheries Subsidies negotiation. On May 26th, USTR submitted a proposal on behalf of the United States to the World Trade Organization to bring attention to the critical issue of forced labor on fishing vessels. Earlier this month, Ambassador Tai addressed the ministerial level meeting of the WTO Trade Negotiation Committee. She made clear that the United States wants a meaningful outcome to the fisheries subsidy negotiations, and that means addressing forced labor. Organizations including Humanity United, the McCain Institute, and the Human Trafficking Legal Center released statements recognizing Ambassador Tai's comments during these negotiations, and we thank them for their continued collaboration on addressing these issues. We hope that countries who have made commitments to ending forced labor will protect fishers from forced labor at the WTO. As we move forward on this endeavor, we want to maintain an open line of communication with each of you listening today, and we hope that you will support these efforts. With regard to the G7, our work in the G7 to address issues of forced labor, on May 28th, Ambassador Tai participated in the G7 trade track meetings with her international counterparts. These discussions on forced labor paved the way for the G7 leaders' statement that included a historic commitment to work together to protect individuals from forced labor and mitigate the risks of forced labor in global supply chains. Now I'd like to mention a few words about a recent meeting of the Taiwan Trade Investment Framework Agreement, or TIFA. USTR is also looking to leverage our TIFA engagements to elevate and address various areas of labor cooperation. For example, on June 29th, the United States and Taiwan held the 11th TIFA Council. During the TIFA Council meeting, the United States discussed the Biden-Harris administration's worker-centered trade policy, where workers must have a seat at the table, strong labor standards that must be enforced, and
like here. Oh, there we go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can now. Yeah, thank you.
And lastly and briefly, I wanted to mention and echo Dr. Johnstone's comments on the updated Xinjiang supply chain business advisory. Earlier this month, USTR joined 5 other federal agencies to issue an advisory for businesses whose supply chains include components from Xinjiang, where Uyghurs and other minority groups are subject to forced labor. In addition to representing unconscionable exploitation, these practices seriously harm economic competition around the world. In conclusion, I wanted to note, these highlights do not capture everything we are doing or everything we have planned, but taken together, these actions and discussions demonstrate our commitment to a trade policy that prioritizes workers around the world. And it is important to note here that for this trade policy to be successful, we need partners like you. Working with you and your companies, producers, and suppliers will help us to meaningfully address forced labor.
I can't wait till we do this in person next.
Is my signal? Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Not sure where you lost me there, but we look forward to continuing discussion with the business community and having a sustained, thoughtful partnership in improving the lives of workers in the United States and around the world. And I too look forward to doing this in person.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh. Eric, would you give the perspective of the DHS?
Thank you, Stefan. I want to thank the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity to participate on today's panel on such an important day. Over the past year, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has made significant strides in the effort to bolster the department's efforts to combat human trafficking and forced labor threats impacting the United States. These threats include the compelled labor of foreign nationals through coercive schemes across sectors of the U.S. economy and importation of goods produced by forced labor into the U.S. supply chain. Since the release of the DHS strategy to combat human trafficking, the importation of goods produced with forced labor, and child sexual exploitation in January of last year, the department opened the DHS Center for Countering Human Trafficking, which is the U.S. government's first ever integrated law enforcement operations center directly supporting federal criminal investigations, victim assistance efforts, intelligence analysis and outreach, and training activities related to human trafficking and forced labor. The center integrates 16 DHS component agencies such as CBP, TSA, Coast Guard, FEMA, and the Secret Service to fuse the department's investigative and enforcement operations, victim assistance, intelligence, and outreach and training resources led by the U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency. The department's authorities to prevent entry into the United States goods made with forced labor has gained a lot of attention over the past year, with U.S. Customs and Border Protection's increased actions to eliminate forced labor from U.S. supply chains, as well as other DHS efforts to stand up against these human rights abuses. Now, focusing on forced labor is modern-day slavery that hurts vulnerable workers, undermines the competitiveness of U.S. businesses, and exposes American consumers to purchasing unethical goods. Under federal law, specifically under 19 U.S. Code 1307, prohibits the importation into the United States of merchandise mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part by forced labor. The department, through U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, authorities to stop goods made with forced labor dates back to the Tariff Act of 1930. However, the Act had a consumptive demand clause, which meant that provided an exception if the U.S. is unable to manufacture or to meet U.S. consumptive demand. But that changed in 2016 when the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015 was signed into law, which removed the consumptive demand clause. CBP's Forced Labor Enforcement Authority is an effective tool to provide economic pressure to end forced labor practices overseas. In addition to CBP's authority, DHS, through the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security investigations, also criminally investigate those who knowingly benefit financially, or receive anything of value from forced labor supply chains due to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Additionally, the department's Blue Campaign is a national public awareness campaign designed to educate the public, law enforcement, and other industry partners to recognize the indicators of human trafficking and how to appropriately respond to possible cases. Blue Campaign works closely with DHS components to create general awareness training and materials for law enforcement and others to increase detection of human trafficking and to identify victims. Additionally, the Blue Lightning Initiative, led by the Department of Homeland Security's U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the Department of Transportation, is an element of the DHS Blue Campaign. The BLI trains airline personnel to identify potential traffickers and human trafficking victims and to report their suspicions to federal law enforcement. To date, more than 70,000 personnel in the aviation industry have been trained through the BLI, and actionable tips continue to be reported to law enforcement. While the compelling reason for me is the moral issue at hand, we cannot forget how forced labor and subsidized industries harm U.S. producers and manufacturers. Forced labor in our supply chains impact all aspects of the Biden-Harris administration's trade policy agenda, including using trade policy to secure America's supply chain, tackle climate change, to protect the U.S. middle class. I'd additionally like to highlight that the department, along with the Department of State, Treasury, Department of Commerce, and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and the Department of Labor were co-signatories to the July 13th updated Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory, which highlighted the heightened risk for business with supply chain investment links to Xinjiang, China. Given the entities complicit in forced labor and other human rights abuses there and throughout China, this updates the original Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory issued by the U.S. government agencies back on July 1st of last year. To support interagency coordination, the department also chairs the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force that was stood up under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and we recently held our second quarterly meeting of this year. This forum allows DHS to ensure that CBP enforcement actions are harmonized with the interagency efforts to end forced labor and prevent human trafficking. In addition to this, the DHS engages with the private sector on forced labor issues through the Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee, as well as events like these, and we greatly appreciate our partnership with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I want to encourage those here today that DHS Trade and Economic Security's ultimate mission is to protect U.S. industry, U.S. workers, and to build a better, more compliant, and more secure U.S. economy and supply chain system. The department doesn't intend to take any actions that will isolate us from our global economic partners at large, because economic interdependence is a key to successful industry and a secure economy. We encourage as many members of the global community to recognize that eliminating forced labor from supply chains will lead to better economic outcomes for the middle class in the U.S. and abroad. And in closing, 25 million workers across the globe are subject to forced labor, and DHS will continue to do everything in its authority to not allow U.S. businesses and consumers to support these human right abuses. This is not only to protect the world's most vulnerable workers, but also an opportunity to build better supply chains. The department can only succeed in this goal with your support. Thank you, and again, I'd like to thank the U.S. Chamber for the opportunity to participate, and I look forward to hearing from our partners in the private sector.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thanks to all of you for those great remarks. We will be, I'm going to direct this question as people offer their questions through the chat box. I'm going to direct this question to each of you as sort of a preliminary inquiry. Obviously there is no silver bullet to eradicate the problem of forced labor. There's no easy way, no easy solution. Supply chains are highly complex and highly diverse and distinct. And we heard in our first panel this morning about some really innovative technological approaches to the issue of eradicating forced labor in a supply chain, at least identifying it, because once you identify it, then you can avoid the sourcing through that or utilizing products or services provided by those who engage in forced labor and trafficking. And I'm curious to each of you is what is your perspective? There's a lot of innovation going on in the business community. There's a lot of work that's being done to try to sort of manage this, because this is here to date really been largely transnational and cross-border, so there's not an easy solution for it. What do how do you all think policymakers can best learn about these innovations from business and reach out to business to gain that information? So I'll open it up to each of you, but I'd like to have each of you give your thoughts on that, if that's okay. Who wants to start?
Well, I can certainly kick off. I mean, I think with regards to supply chain transparency, I know in today's business environment where just-in-time manufacturing and getting products out and delivered are very important, that understanding where our goods come from across the supply chain is not only more and more complex, but very difficult as well. And so one of the things that the department did recently, working through Customs and Border Protection, is we hosted an industry day. One that we know that tried to understand the issue and the difficulties that industry faces with one, understanding or gaining transparency within their supply chains, but also maybe perhaps solutions that we within the U.S. government can leverage as well. So there are some very significant efforts ongoing with regards to supply chain transparency using artificial intelligence as well as machine learning, understanding that these supply chains are incredibly complex, sometimes going well beyond, tier 3 and tier 4 within supply chains, but also leveraging science, going back to things where origin testing, where industry and associations can leverage scientific analysis of goods to see where specific commodities may come from with regards to the origin of the materials that are used in manufacturing. So there are significant efforts ongoing, and I think that as well as whether those within the U.S. government and across the industry working together, that we could definitely leverage the innovation that's occurring within the scientific sectors.
Thank you, Kari. Josh, any thoughts?
Josh, feel free to jump in if you're ready.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So I think that was a great answer from Eric. I mean, ours is rather similar. I mean, I think to the first part of your question, we are always available for folks that want to engage with us, that want to have discussions, that want to talk through problems. I think USTR historically, we've always, I think, been very receptive to any of those sorts of conversations. Certainly are working to expand the network of voices we're hearing in this administration, but that's not to the exclusion of others. We still want to understand kind of what you're experiencing, what you're going through, and what we can do to help address issues of forced labor, as I know we have a shared interest in that. It's not a USTR equity specifically or a USTR tool, but I know Martha Newton from the ILO, formerly my colleague in iLab, mentioned the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, or iLab, at Department of Labor. They have a variety of tools that are intended to help businesses identify supply chain issues and come up with best practices in that regard, including the comply chain tool that I think is available, through all the app stores. And then I think the last point I would make is to me the question, it certainly is forced labor is critical to this line of thinking. And forced labor is what we're gathered here to talk about today, and how we can work together to help end it. But to me, supply chain transparency is a much bigger issue. Everyone on this call has lots of good business reasons to want to know what's happening in their supply chain, be on top of their supply chain, have a good sense of the quality of things that are being produced in their supply chain, and that cuts across so many different areas. So I guess the way I think about it is, yes, we should be looking, downstream, upstream, thinking about ways to address forced labor and supply chains. But we should also be using some of the same tools that are being used for quality control across the supply chain to tackle forced labor as well.
Yeah, and I just want to chime in just before, Kari, you make your comment. I mean, Josh and I first met at some outreach from the USTR. Regarding sort of what's business perspective on things, and I will say there's a lot of appetite within the agencies to engage business on these issues, and frankly we need to build more forums of this nature to try to have those kinds of conversations, because I do think they've worked very well. Sorry, Kari, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worries at all. I agree with everything that you and my fellow panelists have said. We are indeed at the State Department also always happy to hear from the private sector, and learn about what innovative technologies folks are using and maybe interested in exploring in ways that we could collaborate on that. I would also add that, in general, as both of the panelists said, and as you said yourself, Stefan, that the private sector and the governments in general, not only the U.S. government, but other governments, should continue to work together and deepen our collaboration to find new and innovative ways to understand risks of forced labor and supply chains and how we can work together to address them. Those solutions also should be sure to include the workers themselves and the extent to which new technology, whether apps or there are a lot of different innovative technologies being developed to try to tap into the expertise of workers and help identify victims of forced labor as well in the supply chain. So just want to make sure that we include that piece of it also. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we're very close to the end of our time. In fact, we're a little bit over our time, and unfortunately, we won't have any more time for any additional questions. I just want to thank all of you for your time and your participation in today's program. I think we will be, as I said at the outset in the introduction, this is an ongoing dialogue. We look forward to engaging the Biden administration in connection with these issues. I think there's a lot of synergy. There are a lot of synergies that can be achieved by partnering with business in this space because there's such a variety and it's so complex that I think we all stand very well to work together on this. And I think if we work together on it, I think we'll be much better off than if things are imposed. So I really appreciate everybody's time, and I'll turn it over to Michael.
My name is Michael Billick, and I'm the Program Director for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Task Force to Eradicate Human Trafficking. I hope you found today's program informative and enjoyed the remarks. There was a lot to take away, but the bottom line is that the business community stands with governments around the globe, law enforcement, and non-governmental organizations all coming together to fight this heinous crime. More information, including the toolkits that Stefan mentioned,